I kind of had a bit of a chat about what's going to be useful. And I think the most important thing is you've got a huge amount of skill, knowledge and expertise amongst you already. And I am certain, talk to a number of you, you are able to resolve your own questions and challenges on a regular basis. I think therefore what today is about hopefully is just perhaps offering some further information and some kind of conversation. It's really important. This is a safe place to ask your kind of questions, and when I say safe, what I mean is certainly when I was in school leadership, one of the biggest challenges I sometimes had is, where is it safe to ask the questions that people might think I should know the answer to? And I hope today for all of you, you agree that this is a safe place. So please, as it says there, ask lots of questions. Ask questions around the topics we're going to go and equally, if you need to go off piece, then please do that. Ian's already explained that it's going to be a two-part session, and certainly there'll be some, I don't like the word super. I'm not sure quite it describes what we're doing today, but also what we sometimes need in school. I like the word coaching, because I think what coaching does is it's solution focused. In other words, we've probably got the answers between us. It's just being able to kind of find time to do that. And I know for a number of you, you've already got well-established networks, but I do think that meetings like today, for schools working across different local authorities as well, is a really great time to find out actually who can I ask for help, who can I talk to, who was that person that was on that call that time who said something about that. I might go and try and find them, and I'm sure you do a lot of work like this across the trust, but I do think it's a really great chance today to do that. So that's what we're going to be about. Finally, I'm not going to read these things to you. I'm sure Ian's got a copy of them. I'm sure he'll send them out to you. They're your slides, but there are obviously going to be times where I'm going to draw certain parts of slides today, because I think there's some bits that I really want to kind of flag in on. So we're going to start off with the delight that is the Section 175, or if you're in an independent school, Section 157 school return. I hope those of you that are Devon schools will have all now received clarification from us about the template for that and the timescales for doing it. I know that for those of you in Plymouth and Torbay, you're going to have different ways to do this. I know that in Plymouth, as an example, and I'm please, those of you that are Plymouth schools, join in this, because it's actually really useful to find out how different authorities go about this. But here is the guidance. So in preparing these slides, I had the delight of researching actually the Education Act of 2002 and finding, as it says here, Section 175. Now, there are amendments to this. This isn't from 2002. I think the last amendment was 2013, but it hasn't adjusted this very much. In essence, what Section 175 of the Education Act does is these two key points, and I have taken out a few bits of kind of text just to make it really as simple as I can. Effectively, every local authority has got an onus on it to ensure that the schools within its local authority are undertaking their expected requirements. So quite simply, if you want to think of keeping children safe in education and working together as the two documents that drive what it is we should all be doing in schools, this is where it fits in terms of every local authority has a responsibility to do that. Now, what it doesn't say is every school, i.e. you guys, have to send that information back. And I know we've had some challenge in Devon in the past about, well, what happens if we don't send it back? What are you going to do? Well, the reality is what Devon would then need to do is effectively look at another measure, which could involve a visit to actually ascertain why that is. And I think the first thing that would happen is that you would probably have some kind of correspondence with head teacher and chair governors to find out why. That's never been a problem in Devon, but that's where that sits. The second part I think is really crucial as well, and I appreciate in a trust you've got different structures of governance and directors and trustees, but the bottom line is it's actually putting the onus back on the governing body to say, are they undertaking those functions, which is why of course that relates to you in terms of lots and lots of questions. So as those of you that have had a chance to look at Devon's version, we've changed it a bit this year. We've made it hopefully more user friendly for you, and certainly one of the things that we do on an annual basis is we listen to the feedback that you give us. So as I said already, each local authority is going to do that in a slightly different way. In Devon this year, we've delayed it by a month. Normally it would come out to you at the start of September. I took the decision at the start of term that everyone was, I think it's fair to say, pretty busy for the month of September. I appreciate you are now as well, but what we didn't want to do was put something else for you to do. So we've delayed that by a month, and we're therefore asking, can it please be back? The 18th of December is there. End of autumn term is when we're asking for that back in Devon. Now, in Devon, we take an approach where the Section 175 is in two halves, and I think that's really crucial. And I think it's crucial for you as school leaders to think about how this is therefore useful for you and working with both the trust and indeed any local governance that you've got. I think first part one, I refer to as kind of your annual MOT. If you're happy with that analogy, I think of it very much as these are the questions that you really should have answers and possibly even evidence for, because they relate pretty much directly to keeping children safe in education. So as a result of that, for a number of you completing your section 175, you're going to go through that and think, well, there's not a lot different to last year, because clearly if we're still talking about things like, is the training of the DSL every 2 years or equivalent, then that's a question that hasn't changed for a number of years. So there is an element of that. So some of this is going to be pretty straightforward stuff. Some of it will change periodically. So for instance, a couple of years ago, we had some changes around what we should be thinking about when it comes to peer-on-peer abuse, what we should be doing on things like changes around legal terminology on things like upskirting. This year, we've got expectations around reporting if we had concerns about supply teachers. So there are those subtle changes, and that, of course, will be reflected in any section 175. Now, I know that in Plymouth, that's a 2-yearly cycle. So if anybody is in a Plymouth school and they're able to talk about or share some information about how that works across the 2 years, then please do, because as I said, this is your forum. So please, talk to each other as much as I'm going to talk to you. So Ian's on chat watch. So if anybody's happy to kind of tell us about that in a minute, that'd be really helpful. The questions then, the research questions that I refer to, and I couldn't think of a better word than research, because kind of that's what they are. They're questions that effectively, through a range of different groups that my team and myself, we attend. So in Devon, we call it the Devon Children Families Partnership. It's the phrase for what was the local safeguarding board. And as you know, every local authority has got to have a safeguarding board. So Plymouth, Torbay, and Devon, we've got our own. But across a number of the subgroups of that meeting, there will be aspects that those committees, in essence, will want to come out to schools and ask them questions about. As an example, I sit on the sexual abuse subgroup, and one of the questions last year was, how many schools are using or aware of what's called the Brook traffic light tool, and they wanted to gain a picture of that. So it's a way in which we can both check on, if you like, your compliance, and that's, as you've seen in the previous slide, the bottom line of what the Education Act 2002 says. And secondly, I think it's more proactively used to find out what's going on in schools. Ian, do you want to, sorry, Jane, have you, that's great, you've done both. Are you happy to talk to us about what the differences are? And if that'd be really helpful, if I go on mute for a second and you're happy to talk to us, is that okay? Because I think it'd be really helpful for colleagues to know the difference between the two. Is that all right,
Yeah,
Jane?
I was just saying that, yeah, totally, that Chris has too, having done Tavistock and then Plymouth. But mainly the difference is that Plymouth is in all one section, that the follow-up is done through who is the kind of old school improvement leader almost, in that capacity that I had here. One thing that was different was that I think we did ours last year, is that they insist also on having local training, so that the designated leads have knowledge, because obviously my training was done initially in Devon, and then when I came down here, they're very much focused on the procedures that are similar or different within Devon and Plymouth.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Which they are, it is different. I think it's become more aligned, particularly through lockdown. I think that a lot of what we were seeing, having both information, again being a Plymouth school but having a Devon trust, was that there is now more cohesion between, what auditing looks like then in that format. So I think for governors, it's slightly more straightforward than it possibly was before.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. That's really useful to know. And I think the fact that it comes from the same piece of legislation, you would assume that everyone's doing the same. And sadly, sometimes it's not as simple as that. The one thing I think is also important, and a number of you will recognise this, is that you're needing to be able to access different children's social care front door services because of the geography of your school. So as an example, if you're on the kind of Plymouth Devon border or the Plymouth Torbay border or the Devon Plymouth Plymouth Torbay border. It's the postcode that the child lives in where you would make the referral to children's social care if indeed that it was at that threshold. So I appreciate for some of you, I don't know if anybody on the training today, you might even need to be accessing more than 2 different local authorities. So again, these systems are sometimes there to really be helpful, and sometimes that it can feel like we're doubling up on work. But the bottom line is, I think what that section 175, regardless of your local authority, it's a great opportunity to do is to kind of reflect on what it is that you are doing against what you should be doing, because it is coming from that same legislation. Okay, I'm going to continue with this slide and just kind of go through this, and apologies again for those of you that aren't Devon schools, but I'm certain that a similar process is happening across the board. So last year, my team, we read 362 returns. There are just over 400 schools technically in Devon, and a number of schools choose, especially if they're kind of hard federations, they'll send back 1 return. So that's why there's a slight discrepancy between the actual physical number of schools and that. What do we do with them when we read them? Well, the first thing we do is if we notice that there's a concern, we get in touch, and I think I made probably about 6 or 7 phone calls. We tried to divvy these out fairly evenly last year, so I made 6 or 7 phone calls, and it is about offering support. And often, as it says there, are admin errors. It's things like somebody's ticked kind of no when they meant to tick yes, but clearly I think it does demonstrate that we follow those up. We then are asked to analyse the results when all of the return comes in, and it's analysed in terms of graphics, and that's really important. So it's about, for a number of situations, compliance, how many schools as a percentage are doing those things, and clearly there are times when the response will be in part, and that gives a useful conversation. And as I'm sure a number of you know, with any amount of data, it's how you interpret that data and the questions that it raises as a result of that. The ultimate kind of place where this then leads is it's presented to, in Devon we have a subgroup called the Education Advisory Board. That board is attended by Dawn Stab, who's our Director of Education in Devon, and the results are scrutinised at that level, and they are reflected on in terms of what that tells us across the piece in Devon. Now, what's important about any board such as that, and I'm certain that those will exist equally in Plymouth and Torbay, is that those boards are also attended by representatives from the different school associations. So at ours, we've got representation from somebody who's working there within the academies, within maintained schools. There will be further education will be represented, even though they don't have to do a section 175, but it's really useful for them to be there, and our special schools. So there will be all manner of representation across those schools. So I think what's important is that that stuff does happen with that return. I know when I was in school, when I was a head teacher, it sometimes felt like another thing to do, and whatever happened to it. And actually, as an individual school, or indeed as a trust, you won't get the results back in the context that I've just described. But please be reassured that actually that return, when it's crunched together and presented, is really, really useful. And I'll kind of talk quickly now, hopefully, about how useful it is. So we'll use that information, and any local authority, I'm sure, will do exactly the same, because they'd be foolish not to, let's be frank. So it is used when needed for kind of elected officials and senior officers at cabinet level, because clearly it is demonstrating, as that second one that says, that we've done what we were asked to do as part of the Education Act. So it's satisfying that requirement on all local authorities. Every local authority will have an ongoing dialogue with Ofsted. And clearly that dialogue will change. Some of that is very set in stone. So there will be a biannual conversation with Ofsted looking at all schools within the local authority across the piece. And sometimes there are conversations about schools for all sorts of other reasons, including perhaps an Ofsted complaint has come through that Ofsted are quite keen to action because of the nature of the complaint. And while I don't want to talk about obviously individual cases, that would be inappropriate. But that conversation can be kind of leaned towards, well, what else do we know about that school? So a really good example, of course, is that if a complaint were to come in and the local authority were seeking to explore that, then we have the section 175 return, which is really useful. In Devon this year, we've set the date for the end of the autumn term. One of the things that I would say to you, and I appreciate now more so than ever how busy we are, but I think if nothing else, if you can work towards that deadline, that in itself is a significant kind of factor in demonstrating that the school is kind of achieving those aims. I think last year we had only 3 schools that actually we were chasing in March. Now I appreciate that for all sorts of reasons things happen in schools that require changes to the way we work, but if you can get that back on time, I think that's really helpful for you as clearly as well as us. So So our Children Families Partnership are also going to use that to reflect the training that they offer, and indeed the broader training that schools are receiving. So for a number of you in your local authorities, as somebody, as Jane I think just said, you are accessing training that is there and made available and has to be made available through your local safeguarding board. So it offers an opportunity for your local safeguarding board, as was, to be able to scrutinise how things are working. And I think this final bullet point on the top half of this slide is a really important one. While it's a very kind of almost 12 months after the question's been asked, but certainly if you think about how sometimes funding is made available, for instance, for certain aspects of training. So some years back, there was a real focus on offering training to support school leaders and DSLs around domestic abuse. Part of that kind of training funding came from the fact that within the Section 175, there was a recognised gap in what schools were being able to access. So while it often takes 2, sometimes even 3 terms for that information to come back, to be analysed, to be scrutinised, to go through the different levels of the local authority, what it does do in fullness of time is it provides information to say, look, there is a need. So when I talk about those research questions, it often comes off the back of that. So please, again, be reassured that while sometimes we don't see the direct impact of that in terms of weeks or sometimes months afterwards, there is absolutely, without a doubt, and I'm now the other side of that. I'm not school-based. I'm now working within kind of the commission role for the local authority. I can really see how the two connect, and I would really encourage you, certainly those of you that are looking at the Devon one, to, when you get to that part B, is to be absolutely certain that the comments that you put down there will be looked at, will be read, and will be really, really helpful in driving some of those conversations forward. So I hope that gives enough information on that. So again, what are you getting out of it? And I hope it's important that you do see an immediate benefit to it. I've already alluded to the fact that I kind of see it as a bit of an MOT, an annual MOT of provision. And I think, please be assured that saying that some things that you're doing are in part, while might sound challenging at the time, I think that's any school environment where we're reflective and able to say, are we doing that perhaps as well as we could, has got to be in itself a school that is moving in the right direction. So it's for you to reflect on that. It's for you to make sure that those statutory requirements are in place. And clearly, the second bullet point, it's a great opportunity to discuss and share that with governors and directors. Now, we certainly suggest that, while not in its entirety necessarily, but the safeguarding governor, the named safeguarding governor, should be able to be involved in this process. One of the key things that this document gives you an opportunity to do, which is challenging, certainly for those of you that are DSLs, is actually how do we satisfy governors that safeguarding is effective when we should never be talking to governors about individual children and families. So we're then getting into the realms of this type of information, which talks very much in terms of data, in terms of information, in terms of policies, procedures and practices, where we can evaluate the effectiveness of safeguarding. And then, as it said in the paragraph from section 175, it is the responsibility ultimately of governors to make sure that this is happening. So I think to use this as a working alongside a safeguarding governor, for the safeguarding governor to have access to this, to be part of this, and ultimately in places to be kind of, are they effective in their role, is a question, should be a question within any section 175. It is clearly a useful part of this process. So hopefully that's available to everybody, and I know at the moment that's likely to be through virtual means, which might even be better actually. I know one of the challenges in the past with governors, especially governors that are still working that have jobs, is how do you do that during a school day when we want to be doing that. So maybe that's a better way of doing things. And the final bit really is, I would hope that feeding back from those top 2 points, that any changes, adaptations, things that you found out about, things that you need to develop, can form part of your school development planning process. I know that everyone's on a different cycle slightly for how and when they do their school development plan, school improvement plan, and again the terms will be different from school to school, but I do think it's crucial that safeguarding should sit within that document. Most of us are fully aware of the implications of safeguarding, both in terms of morally for the children, that's right that we're safeguarding these children, but also through inspection. So if it can sit within your development plan, for me that makes perfect sense. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to touch base with everyone and ask, is there any questions that anybody's got, or indeed any comments, any additions? Because as I said, this is your forum, it's a conversation, not a lecture, I hope. So please talk back to me. Anybody wants to ask anything about anything I've said that didn't either sound sensible, clear, or has anybody got anything to add, please say something. And again, Ian, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add at this bit around how, as the trust, you're looking at the the section 175 as a document to use.
Yes, thanks, John. While people think if they've got any questions or comments for the chat, I had a look through the S175 last week, and I thought, that's a really rich set of questions to be thinking about, to be helping with populating safeguarding action plans. As John has acknowledged, this is a really, really tricky, really busy time for everybody. But one thing I'm intending to do in the spring is, if you're not lucky enough this year to have a visit from John for the safeguarding audit, then I'm intended to come around in the spring and chat to people to see how far they've got since their last audit. And some of the S175 questions are good conversation starters. So I really do commend those. I've given time. There's nothing in the chat, John. So I think if you carry on.
Fab. Okay. So my next topic really is the idea that Ofsted, since probably I think we noticed this starting up in third week in September, I think was our first visit, and I believe that is there somebody on the session today who's had a visit from inspection this term? Is that right? Or was I imagining that, Ian?
Yeah, it's the amazing Joe Arscott.
Hey Joe, so I'm going to kind of come to you in a second then, if that's all right, Joe. I'll give you a bit of thinking time, but if you're happy in a minute to just give us a 2-3 minute summary of how that went, the types of questions, because then if I say you go after me, because then if I'm wrong, you'll look great and I'll look stupid, and that's the right way to be. So if that's all right, Joe, if you're happy to do that in a second. So there's a little bit of kind of conflict, I think, when this first kind of came about why this is happening. And I know, to start off with, Ofsted framed this as visits, and I think there was a bit of a legal challenge. I believe NEHT challenged that and said, you've got no legal course to visit schools, you have to inspect or you don't inspect, so which is it? And I think then it kind of turned to, okay, so we'll now inspect and we'll put it under section 8 of the framework, but they're visits. So that's where we got to. There's a little quote here from Amanda Spielman, who I'm sure lots of you know is the chief HMI at the moment, and I think we're always, as school leaders and those of us that work in that kind of area, going to be slightly skeptical about what does that mean. Now, I have to be honest, from the feedback I've had in Devon so far, and Joe, I hope you'll be able to perhaps just talk. The question was, Joe, is that I think you've had a visit from Ofsted of these nature, and I'm hoping in a minute you'll be happy to give your colleagues just a kind of a 2-3 minute overview of what that was like. And I'm hoping you're going to totally agree with everything I'm about to say, but the simple reality is it really is then from a kind of your perspective, because as we know with any inspection, they're going to be different from school to school depending on all sorts of factors. Is that all right, Joe? So if I give you kind of 5 minutes to, as I say, start thinking that through, and then I'll be quiet and you have a chat. So key thing is, and these aren't inspections, and I think what separates them from inspections in some ways is that they feel, the feedback that I've had from a number of schools in Devon now, they feel a lot softer. They feel a lot more kind of less data driven, and that's for all sorts of reasons, obviously. But equally, there are some aspects that we want to be mindful of for safeguarding, because I hope none of us are naive to think that anybody visiting our schools from Ofsted is not going to have their eyes and ears open to what they might see. So what we've tried to do here, and we've sent this out recently through our safeguarding newsletter, which I'm hoping you guys get access to as well. I think, Ian, you share that across the trust, don't you? I appreciate that it goes out to schools in Devon, but you're sharing that wider afield. We kind of tried to think, and I worked with one of our school effectiveness team, Brad Murray. Some of you will know Brad. Brad's a serving Ofsted inspector still as well, so it was quite useful to work with him from the kind of what he's had through Ofsted HQ, as it were, and what I know and think from my kind of like crystal ball gazing and thinking about what might be done. So single central record continues to be a document that for a number of us we are mindful that is a great place to check a number of things, including clearly the safe recruitment of staff, both historical, but more so perhaps I would say the focus is going to be on COVID. When you've recruited during a time where perhaps you rightly haven't had staff into school, how have you ensured that you've still maintained those clear expectations in part 3 of keeping children safe? And I know I'm doing a session, I think after half term, for some of the more administrative business manager side of things, where we're going to go through some of the detail of that. So, but that's quite important. Attendance is clearly a focus. I know that both during COVID and as children started to come back in perhaps greater numbers in June, but also for those vulnerable groups and your key workers, that continues to be something. And now certainly there's a great seems to be focused on visits this term that are talking about very much where are you against where you would have expected to be, what are the reasons for children not being in school, how are you promoting, monitoring perhaps children who are deemed to be vulnerable. And when we say vulnerable, one of the key vulnerabilities clearly is that if a child has a child protection child in need plan, how are you maintaining contact with that child and indeed those agencies that are working with children. That could be early help as well, depending on the nature of the early help that's being offered. So that seems to be a real focus. There definitely seems to be both a little bit of a question, but also a focus on, how did you maintain effectively that referral process through lockdown? So when those concerns perhaps came to you either through information, perhaps through VISTs or other means of communication where children weren't in school, how did you both make contact with families and indeed make contact with children's social care? Again, a reflection on have things gone up, down? Where are we with referrals? What did that look like during COVID and indeed now? What are we doing in school that's changed? Now, clearly, your reporting systems are going to be very similar because you use CPOMS as a system, but what were those changes? What did you notice? Policies, how did you change policies? Now, for those of you that are in Devon, we shared with you on 2 occasions 2 amendments to your safeguarding policy linked to COVID. But I suppose the question that inspectors are asking is, well, that's fine, you've got the policy on your website. How was that shared? How was that shared through staff, through governance? What changes needed to make as a result of that? That's quite important. Tracking your vulnerable families and indeed continuing to do so, thinking very much around those kind of RAG rating grids that I know a number of you were asked to fill in. Seems ages ago now, doesn't it? But those grids and how we kept on top of those, how we made sure that contact was made with those families and what that looked like, how you escalated that if indeed you needed to. Remote learning is something that Ofsted are very, very keen to explore at the moment, and it really does seem to be. I've read now several of the visit notes that have come back following some of the visits, and what is really clear is there's definitely questions about how is learning being offered when it's virtual, when it's online, but also how is their safety built into that, both for the children and indeed the staff. So that seems to be a bit of a pattern there. And again, what is it that we're kind of sharing with children and indeed their families about their own use for children of safe internet use? I know a number of websites for schools have been used really well with additional links, areas that you've kind of directed children to. I know some schools sent kind of information home to families for them to have about, kind of how to ensure that, for instance, filters were in place, because one of the things that we know is that children have used the internet in a hugely greater way during lockdown. So those are the types of things that we know are going on. Joe, would you be happy just to give us a flavour of your visit, and in particular, I suppose, what I appreciate colleagues might want to ask separate questions, but from a safeguarding lens, what was it that you felt that they really focused in on, and how did they go about that business? Because I think that's what's crucial. That's what we really want to know in some ways, is what did they ask, but what did they want to know as a result of those questions? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
Brilliant, thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Great, super. So talking about the policies, they drilled down quite a lot into the policies, and they wanted to know not just about the safeguarding policy, but how that impacted on other policies. So they also wanted to know the impact on the behaviour policy, and particularly the remote learning. We spent quite a lot of time on safeguarding around remote learning and how we ensured that messages got out to staff and children and to families. And then obviously the safeguarding policy. They also spent quite a lot of time talking about families who were either on TAF or who we identified throughout lockdown and what we did to support those families. So that's probably that's what we spent quite a lot of time on, talking about how we were supporting families and how we identified families as being vulnerable. So not just families who were the pupil premium or who had how we defined vulnerable really. So it wasn't just sort of your textbook definition, it was who did we as a school decide was vulnerable and why. So we spent quite a lot of time on that as well.
That's great, thank you. And I think that term vulnerable is one that certainly in any training that I deliver, children come in and out of vulnerability as well. So it's quite right and proper. If we're just looking at a published list, well, that's, to be fair, missing the point about what you know about your family. So I think that's worth noting in terms of for all of us, if we're likely to have one of these visits at a point before and nobody's really sure yet. I know January's being muted is when section 5s and 8s are going to start again, and I think there'd probably be a bit of challenge on that at the moment in terms of the approach.
Tell us that they're only doing 1,200 schools. Oh, I'm really sorry, the dogs have decided it's lunchtime.
Yeah, no, that's right. There's 1,200 schools.
Yeah, and the single central record they looked at, they wanted to look at new starters and find out how we'd recruited safely during that time. But he did also take a wider look at it, and he said that wasn't part of the inspection, but that he would look at the rest of the single central record as well. So just to be aware of that, really, that he did look very closely at the new starter that we recruited, but he did also look at the rest of it as well.
That's really helpful, thank you. I think single central record is a gift to inspectors, quite frankly, because it's a very, very kind of black and white document. It either is or it isn't. I don't have to make a judgment, and I appreciate that these inspections at the moment are making judgments at all in terms of good, outstanding, or otherwise. But I think we need to be mindful, as has just been said there by Joe, that if it's in front of me and I'm looking at 2 files of new stars, I might as well look at the rest while I'm here. So I think that's a really good heads up. Does anybody want to ask any questions about either these questions, anything that Joe's just said, or anything of me directly on this before I move these slides on, talking about evidence and what we might look at? Please, if there's any questions that anyone's got. Ian, is there anything that you want to add at this time? I think it was really helpful to hear from Joe from first-hand experience, but we're never going to second guess what they are or aren't going to do. Is there anything anybody wants to add or ask?
There's nothing in the chat, John. I just want to obviously acknowledge what is known at the schools, that at the moment we're in transition in terms of who is mainly looking after the single central record, and in due course, as and where, I think within Joe's inspection at St Peter's, Helen was there and had been working on it and was able to keep talking through it. In the future, it's highly likely that if you have a visit or an inspection, then we'll be arranging for Hannah Hobson from the HR team to be available for that SCR chat. But we're just kind of in between at the moment. So if you do find yourself getting a call and you're not sure who's the best person to talk through the SCR, then let me or Hannah know. That'd be great.
Okay, good.
Back to you, John.
Thank you. So let's just look at kind of thinking about that, and I kind of put my Ofsted kind of thought processes and thinking, well, what evidence might we be able to show, especially given at the moment where these visits are very much separated from school. They're not about inspectors moving around the school as perhaps they would have done in the past. So it's very much what can we provide for them. So minutes are always going to be great of meetings, and a variety of meetings, including governors, senior team. Clearly for some of you, your CPOMs you use to hold information. I think take a very sensible view on sharing that type of information with inspectors. I know some of you feel sometimes a little bit uncomfortable about the fact that this is kind of confidential information, and it is, and we need to treat it carefully, which is why I would always say, we don't print any safeguarding records for anyone off unless we're satisfied that through perhaps children's social care, we've got a valid reason to do that. But I do think we need to also be able to demonstrate to inspectors that actually we're doing what we said we would do in keeping these children safe. So for me, it's very much a where am I doing this? This is in a safe room. Am I sharing a screen perhaps to be able to do that? But some of you I know will be familiar with the anonymized function. So I think make sure you say to any inspector you're sharing records with of that nature, records with you. I want you to respect that these are confidential, look them in the eye almost, and make sure that they're really clear that this is a conversation I'm having because I trust that you're here wanting to ascertain that we are recording things in an appropriate way. So that's always my advice on that. So data clearly is going to be really helpful. I always think that coming into a school, one of the questions that I would want any DSL to be able to know is the numbers of children. How many children have you currently got on child protection, child in need plan? How many children have you got that are working at early help level in terms of with external partner agencies? What provision have you got in place? In some ways, it's very much like that kind of data analysis of your what would have been kind of achievement data, and while not as in depth and in detail, and you're not looking at across a range of subjects. It's quite rightly that you should be confident to be able to talk about things like number of inquiries made, and certainly during that COVID period. Websites are a telling one. Inspection teams, as I'm sure you know, will be looking at your websites beforehand. Please make sure that your policies are in date and right and properly kind of edited to make sure that the right people are now listed as, for instance, DSLs. I still go into a lot of schools where those policies are last year's policies or even 2 years ago, and they'll say, well, but we have done it, and it's like you're allowing me to ask a question that you don't want me to ask, which is just use your website as a tool to show everybody, including the right people, i.e. parents and families, and indeed your staff, that the things that are there are there as resources. If you use logs to keep a note of what training you've done, when you change, for instance, the use of 1-minute guides, the emails that you might send around, the little and often training that you're doing with staff, and I appreciate that that's been in a very blended model in the last kind of 7 or 8 months, but anything like that you've got, I think, is a really good document to be able to share. It really highlights both the work that you're doing, but also the culture of school. In other words, this isn't just about, as it says there, I've evidenced that everyone's read Keeping Children Safe and Code of Conduct, and we've done 1.5 hours worth of training in September. For me, that's kind of missing the point about what we want to show with a robust culture, which is actually that safeguarding is a continuous theme in yes, front-loaded probably in your inset days at the start of the year for many of you, or indeed in January, depending on your cycle. But I definitely would want you to be able to show them the other stuff that you do, and please don't lose sight of those little things, how important they are, because that's what demonstrates culture, and an effective culture to boot. So obviously Joe's helpfully said single central record, and remember it's compliance with part 3 of Keeping Children Safe. There are certain things that I would always recommend are on single central records, for instance references, because quite frankly I think that they're a crucial part of your work in ascertaining that somebody is safe to work with children. But we can take the view, Ofsted might take the view, some of us might take the view, but if it doesn't say we don't have to, why should we? My view is that actually if we only ever did what we should have to do, then we might be missing the point again. So but certainly we should be able to show those individual files of staff that we've recruited through COVID and how we have got that first-hand information. For instance, it may well be that on the day of interview we saw somebody's passport on the screen, but now that they've started in school, we've actually taken a copy of that. And I do think there's a huge place for that anecdotal information. I know the amazing both creativity and imagination that schools have had in how they've kept in touch. I know that in some settings it's been the delivery of kind of food parcels or vouchers. I know for some schools it's been staff that have chosen to kind of on their day off, because they work perhaps part-time, to walk a different route with the dog, just to walk past that house where perhaps you haven't heard from that family, and actually somebody has their eyes on and just happened to have an informal conversation because the children were out playing in the garden. And those things I think are important, and while they might sound a little bit sneaky, I think they're massively important because they add value to this is what's in our policy procedures, but the reality is this is how we had to adapt. So anything that's on that, and of course more stuff as well. We haven't got time today to go into huge amounts of detail on what else you were doing, but I do think there's a place for that kind of anecdotal stroke, what we did alongside what we can show. So Ian, is there anything you want to add to any of that, please? Anything that you feel is important that across the trust schools should be able to evidence?
Yes, I do, John. And I think the first thing to front up is years ago we did an exercise at St Michael's where we divided into 2 groups, the filers and the pilers, in relation to our document management. So I am definitely a piler, and not ashamed of that. However, when I do go around schools, a lot of the conversations I'm having is about formalising the informal. So talking to some colleagues yesterday about their ongoing discussions about safeguarding in cases. Great, can we get a simple record of your safeguarding team meetings so that you've got a trace? I'm really not into files for files' sake, but I think this is a really useful list of the kinds of things you could be capturing, just as that trail of your actions that you are taking, of the monitoring that you're doing, and just so you've got that evidence there when it's ready, and in one grab and go place, I would say as well. I'm grateful to my friend for putting a comment in the chat there to validate the levels of piling. But enough about me.
Cool. Okay. So just a couple of things really that I wanted to share with you. And again, apologies for those of you that are working in Plymouth and Torbay schools. The simple reality is I haven't got access to the information that MASH and Children's Social Care colleagues provide that I can kind of give you a flavour of here. I don't think probably there's any difference. So while I'm saying Devon, but please interpret this, I think probably across the country, or England certainly to a degree. So I just thought it'd be useful to give you a flavour of some of the picture that we saw as kind of we went into lockdown, through lockdown, as I say, vulnerable groups, key worker children, then when we had more year groups come back in June, and then obviously back in September. So I'm going to run through these relatively quickly because we've only got 10 minutes left. So it won't come as a surprise that since children have come back, we have seen a quite a sharp rise in inquiries coming into children's social care, and that during lockdown initially we saw quite a significant dip. And I think there is some debate around the reasons for that, but I think what it does highlight is the significant impact that as schools we have on a system whereby children coming into school, we are pretty much one of the key frontline partners for safeguarding, in terms of it's us that are making those inquiries. And we know in Devon about a third of all inquiries come from education. So, well, I can't prove that. Nationally, you'll have seen, no doubt, all sorts of things reported in the media, both nationally and locally, but we've estimated somewhere around a rise of about 50% in DVA services. And I would suspect, my gut feeling is that's probably higher, but that's what's been reported. So domestic abuse, including domestic violence, has had a significant rise across all groups, all demographic groups. It's not just in areas of deprivation. That really has been quite stark, actually. We have seen greater numbers of disclosures, although we didn't perhaps see the number of disclosures in the initial weeks of children returning in September. That picked up over time. Again, in hindsight, I think that makes sense. Children did need some time to actually become that feeling of safety in schools again, that they had those trusted adults. They didn't walk through the door and tell us on day one. And certainly one of the things that we've seen of disclosures across all age groups is it's primary schools where there have been a greater number of disclosures. So again, for you guys, you're all primary schools, thinking very much around that. What is it that children are telling us? It is primary age children who are making those disclosures now, and indeed that's being fed through. We saw a significant drop in county lines involvement with vulnerable children, certainly kind of perhaps older children during lockdown. The police's theory on that was basically because everyone was supposed to be at home, they would have stood out more. And surprise, surprise, since lockdown changed through kind of May and June, more and more children were involved in county lines operations because, quite frankly, people were needing to catch up with trade. And that's a sad, flippant statement, but unfortunately it's true. So there's a wealth of evidence, and you might have seen some recent media coverage about how arrests have been made on the M5 of kind of gangs coming in and out of the county. And again, it would be something certainly that I think, if you're thinking of inspection, moving forward into inspection, I think certainly county lines and exploitation is going to be a huge topic that inspectors will want to know staff have got an awareness of and what they're looking out for. We've seen, so channel refers to exploitation through radicalisation. There's been a dip in channel referrals, and I think that's been part due to the amount of children that haven't been in school. And what we also know is that certainly for a number of children, perhaps where that exploitation has been absolutely through online means, we know that they're spending a huge amount more time online. So sadly, we're waiting for probably that effect to kick in terms of more referrals into channel, as indeed those concerns become known in schools. SARC is a sexual assault referral centre, and any strategy meeting where there is a concern that a child may have been sexually abused, if that's one of the reasons or the reason why the strategy meeting is taking place with your children's social care colleagues, we in Devon have seen a 50% rise in SARC attendance at those meetings. So that highlights how a significant percentage of additional concerns around sexual abuse have taken place. Now, what we've also seen is that actually a number of those concerns are around peer-on-peer abuse, and the pattern appears to be very, very generically, but the pattern appears to be a growing number of what we'll refer to as perhaps 10 and 11-year-olds who are abusing their younger siblings and within the home environment. And the concern is that nobody can prove this at the moment, but the concern is that because those older children, i.e. year 5, 6, are watching, seeing materials online of a potentially harmful nature, i.e. they're accessing an awful lot of porn, potentially what they're then doing is acting those kind of things that they've seen out on their younger siblings. So that's a growing pattern that we've seen. I can't prove that with numbers, but certainly the anecdotal stuff and the conversations that I have with colleagues in MASH. I don't want to not ask questions, but I'm going to just get through to the end, I think, now, and then please ask questions as we go. Keeping children safe, I'm hoping that everybody by now should have got this kind of signed off in terms of we've done that. Similarly with code of conduct, you should have staff that have read, signed, agreed that and have evidence of that. I would definitely encourage you to do that, as well as that kind of acceptable user stuff, use of IT, including in foundation stages, which might be slightly different or will be slightly different for a number of you. But it's really important that you have got signatures to say that, you know, that has happened. I would definitely encourage you to have got copies of that so that you can verify that. Staff should be really clear on changes within KITSI, including as I alluded to earlier, that they should be sharing any concerns that they have about supply staff. I think supply staff's unfortunate. I would argue any visitor, be that a contractor, be that agency or a parent or carer, you know, we should be encouraging staff to see those adults the same as they should see their peers in terms of the whistleblowing nature of our work, sadly. I'm still mindful that for some schools, part 5, that peer-on-peer abuse isn't an aspect that is involved in much of training, and it's still there in keeping children safe. So I think those periodic messages and just highlighting some of the points that I made about how, you know, kind of children perhaps at the top end of primary school we're seeing a growing trend in because of perhaps what they've seen or had access to during lockdown, how their behaviours might be changing. There are no changes in part 3, which is good. That's your safer recruitment section, but it does, and I think we've highlighted it, you know, please remember that you're going to potentially be scrutinised on how can you demonstrate that you've safely recruited, given that nothing changed during lockdown, to ensure that all of the same measures were undertaken for any new staff. So some information there. Just one subtle change that we Brexit, as I know a number of you all have been aware of. Quite sure what's happening with Brexit at the moment, like everyone else, but what we do know is that from January there's going to be a subtle change in teacher recruitment potentially, and I've just put that on here and you've got the link to it should you need it. But in essence, through the application process, obviously through the where have you worked, where have you lived in the last 5 years, we should now be scrutinising any teacher that's taught overseas, and what we're effectively doing is we are looking at checking with that country's, if indeed they have one, regulatory body. So in the UK at the moment, that's through the teacher referral agency, where we would check their suitability, i.e. have they been barred from teaching. We should now be seeking, and as it says here, where available, and we simply don't know, we should be checking where we can get information to make sure that if they have taught overseas, that indeed they've not been barred in a similar way that they might have been, sorry, prohibited, not barred. Barred list is a separate check, prohibited from being a teacher. And lots of you I know do those TRA checks, print them off, and you have the little alerts and none. We should be seeking that from overseas. I think there'll be more information to come, but here's a heads up for you should you be looking at recruitment in the next few weeks. The last slide for me, just to draw your attention to Lara and Caroline, who are part of the team. So both of them, contact details there. If you can't reach me, if you find yourself in a situation where you need some support quite urgently, there are 2 other people to try, as well as email addresses. Okay, Ian, I'm conscious of time. I've talked quite a lot and people haven't asked many questions. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing. I'm sure you'll say it's probably a good thing. But what I would just say is if there's anything anybody wants after today, then please, you know, the same messages as ever. Don't hesitate to get in touch. You're kind of purchasing our services. Please make use of them. Ian, back to you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful as always. If the next 3 minutes, if you do have any questions or comments for Jon, please do pop them in the chat. I've put in the chat a link to Jon's 1-minute guides, which are really useful for CPD, and also a link to that October newsletter that he referred to. So have a look at those. I'm thinking out loud, Jon, that actually you mentioned peer-on-peer abuse. I'm wondering if that should be the topic for the first hour of our next forum, which is in December. So people out there, if you think that's a good idea, then I'll just pop a message on here, and maybe you could put some thumbs on that, or if you've got thumbs up on that, or if you've got other suggestions for topics, please do drop those in the chat. Okay, so yeah, my message is there. If you think that's a goer, then just give that the thumbs up, or other suggestions or any questions for Jon in the last 2 minutes. I'm taking these as likes for the topic, not likes for me. They're raining in, Jon. They're raining in. So we'll give that some planning. I've got some thumbs and I've got some yes pleases as well. Terrific. It's ever so strange, isn't it? All this sort of silent working. What I really love about the forums that Jon does live is that interaction with each other. So really glad that we can now move across into a situation where you can interact with each other with cameras on and mics on. So what we're going to do, going to pop a link in the chat here for the Zoom meeting, or you've got your other one. What I'm going to ask you to do is come off this call, join the Zoom call, make sure you've got through, and then going to give everybody until 10 past to have a comfort break, grab a cup of tea if it's tea o'clock for you. If you're in school, try and avoid anybody who might bring you some kind of issue that you've got to deal with so that you miss out. And then so if you join the Zoom call and then go for 10 minutes, come back at 10 past, I'll give you a very quick introduction to what we're going to be doing, and then we'll be quickly into breakout groups to get to know each other a bit, find out about each other's roles, and explore ways that you can support and encourage each other in this really challenging role that you do. So Jon, thanks so much for part 1. Jon is staying for part 2. Your link to Zoom is here, and the video for this will be available to you through the same link that that you joined the meeting with. So I'm going to stop recording, and I'm going to leave the meeting.